Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. You're the host, Brett Wetzel and Kevin Cuppus. What do you? I see your home. You look like
Yeah.
the yeah.
You and that Pat guy quit complaining about my background.
It looks like you're at my grandma's house. I can see it looks like wood paneling in the back and like these
Wood
flowery curtains.
This is my daughter's old room. I'm not buying new curtains.
I know, but you look like you're ready to plot something horrible.
Maybe I am. It's been a rough month. No, I'm home. I'm just getting like jobs cleaned up. Obviously, we can't really do any work on the sales floors because it's hell week. And I carried 4 pallets of Danfoss parts up 3 flights of stairs, so I'm pretty much dead.
Why'd you do that?
Oh, it's because it's where they had to go. Because I'm getting ready to do another month-long EMS conversion.
Haven't they give you like an intern yet, or someone like just a trainee, just to
No.
carry? Why?
There was a shop kid that helped me get most of it, but he was bringing the pallets in, and I was getting them in the motor room because this store is just an absolute of a back room. It's downtown, so there's no way to get like anything in here. There's all these vendors in there trying to get their stuff in there, so we're bringing pallets in there, and people are just having meltdowns.
That's what I just don't understand. I don't understand why. I don't know. Give you a guy to train, so maybe you don't have to. You could do a little bit less or have it more focus on other things. I don't get that.
We don't have anybody, so we are that busy. Like I can't believe we're still like doing lineup change outs the week of Thanksgiving.
That is crazy because it's blackout week. This is the week that everyone like stops.
Yeah, we're doing a Costco startup still the day of grand opening. Everybody's behind. So like the blackout is gone. It probably won't even be back next year. Like it's just gone.
Not gonna do blackouts anymore. That's all right. We can work right through Thanksgiving and Easter and Christmas and everywhere else.
Right through that. Like it was like, we did it once. Why not just get rid of it altogether? Which I don't care because like it makes the construction department slow when they do that because there's nothing unless there's new construction going on. There's no work. But now there's the opposite, and it's like November, and we're doing 70-hour weeks still.
That is crazy.
Like last week I had 85 hours. Week before that it was 95.
Lightweight.
Yeah, like I don't miss doing that stuff. Like I absolutely hate doing that. And doing 95 hours on a construction job is a lot different than doing 95 hours in a service truck. It's just you get a lot of downtime in the service truck. Like it's 95 hours of being in the same exact place. Yeah.
I was broke Sunday. Friday I got home from Houston, and I told you I worked 44 hours and 48 hours, and I got home after I drove home, and I was like I was so smoked. I was trying to keep my eyes open. I was trying to watch a show with the kid, and I just kept passing out. I get it. And I was gonna say what I've been doing, but it's Monday. Or no, it's Tuesday, and it's Turkey Day in 2 days. So I'm at home. I'm going to Houston next week. Yeah, it's really all that I really got going on. That and meetings.
Thanksgiving. Fun. I despise Thanksgiving.
Why?
I don't know. Like
is there anything you do?
Yeah, I don't know. I always picked on.
Do you like puppies? Do you like puppies?
Call for Thanksgiving. Always took on call for Thanksgiving every year. I've had it for the last 13 years in a row. Except not on call anymore. But I just despise Thanksgiving. Like turkey. So that, and then it's the best on call day.
Why? Because the calls are usually dumb. Where it's usually they're just overburdened.
They're usually like they don't want you there, so they're only open till noon if they are open.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those BS holidays where you're not really missing anything because you're probably going to your sister-in-law's house, and who wants to go there?
Do you have hold on? You have a sister-in-law, don't you?
Yes. But
what's her name so I can look it up and tell her what episode to watch?
And then everything else. And then here's the deal: like you get called out on Friday morning, on Black Friday morning. Yeah. You walk in the store before everybody else, and you go find what you want, and you get yourself some doorbuster deal, and just walk up there before the store opens and get your nice TV or laptop. Telling you, that is the best holiday statistically to get.
On call.
On call.
Speaking of family and togetherness. Oh, okay. I guess can't talk about that. All right, never mind. What are we talking about tonight? Winter PMs. We're going to talk about winter PMs. So, what you do in the winter time for your PM. So, obviously, it gets cold. So, there's certain things that we should be checking to make sure they're functioning. You want to take it off, and I'll follow.
First off, guys, whether your customer has a PM schedule, obviously you're following that for the most part, but always deviate a little bit and check things that I'm going to check. But wintertime, I try to split things up quarterly, if however I'm doing it, like what I'm checking. But when I'm doing my winter, like fall PMs, whatever you want to call it, if it's fall or it's winter, so I'm going to be checking my condenser fan cycling and condenser operation, making sure that all my fans cycle off or nothing's wired hot from some summer disaster and they had to bypass contactors because they're all burned out or something stupid like that and they got missed. And making sure that my condenser flooding valves are in auto operation and are not valved off, or pressurization valves are not valved off, and then everything is set up and ready to go and not and set to the proper pressures. I'm going through all of that and making sure that everything is ready to go for the winter operation of the rack, meaning that the holdback set, that the A9 set, that the fans are set up correctly, that I have enough refrigerant in there, that my split valve splits and pumps out correctly. And is, if it already isn't split, making sure the split side is empty and I don't have a check valve bleeding back, and making sure that nothing is leaking in.
So,
Good.
sorry, I had a question about that. So, I've only had a couple of those check valves go bad, and whether it be the magnet checks or the rebuildable ones. And typically, most of the time, if it's a magnet check one, once I cut it out, I look to see what happened. And a lot of times it's either usually crap in the valve that's causing it not to close. So like when you do the buildable ones, once again, it's usually some kind of crap. And what I've found is if you have a rack with multiple problems as far as like oil issues or moisture issues where wax is ending up being created, a lot of times it'll make those check valves not close all the way, and then that ends up causing your crap that's happening with your split.
Yeah, I generally see the mega checks fail when they stick. I've never personally seen a 4-bolt rebuildable stick, but it's always been a mega check and it's always got it. I'm not a big fan of the non-serviceable check valves just for that simple reason, because I'd rather just take it apart and clean it and be done with it and
Mm.
then have to cut the whole thing out. There is screens in some of those. I don't think it that whatever the MagaCheck brand is, if it's Streamline or whatever, but there is one brand that has a screen in it,
Okay.
and I have gotten screwed by this screen. So some of the racks, they pipe them in the outlet of the receiver, and they use it for, there's a check valve basically going around the ambient bypass, and basically it has flow through this check valve when the ambient bypass is closed. That check valve screen is super fine. It's like a TXV screen almost.
Mm.
So it's on the outlet of the receiver, so it catches all the shit before the dryer shells do.
Oh, you, wait a minute. You talking about the which check valve?
So
Hold on. Let me.
it's a check valve on the outlet of the receiver. So it comes directly out of the receiver. There
Oh,
is a ball valve, and then a check valve pointing towards the liquid shell dryers. Then on the other side of that check valve, there is a automated ball valve, and that's the ambient bypass. So it's bypassing the drop leg to the dryer shell, basically.
oh, okay. So basically, you'd have a bypass from here over to here, right?
Yes, and there's a check valve, so it can't flow backwards into the receiver. Now,
Gotcha. We're usually right about yeah.
yeah, that check valve, whatever brand it is, I forget what it is. It has like a super fine screen in it,
Mm-hmm.
and it plugs up.
Hmm. Gotcha.
It was enough where it was causing the sight glass to flash heavily, and then ended up having a 30-pound drop across it. So I
Gotcha.
cutting it out, and I ended up straight piping it for the time being. But because I didn't have a check valve, an inch and an eighth check valve at 2 a.m.
No, I got you. We're talking about making sure the split is active. These are typically the check valves that we're talking about. I don't, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of an actual schematic where it actually has the normally open solenoid on both ends. Usually, on this instance that I'm showing you here on the screen, you have this three-way valve that'll put flow through both directions, through both condenser sides of the coil, and then when we deactivate it, yeah, when we deactivate or when we activate it, sorry, when we activate it, this is going to stop the flow over to here, and then this valve should actually energize as well. And you see that where it says right here, it's hard to see, but it basically says restrictor. That restrictor right there is going to be some sort of port, whether it be almost a, whatchamacallit. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it.
I'm a way bigger fan of the Sporlan pump out valves where they got those orifice solenoids. Those things work really well and they pump out quite fast.
They have a lot of times, even on the Target racks, they'll have a little quarter-inch male to female
Orifice.
Yeah, it looks like a coupling, but it's an orifice inside there. There's actually raid, and sometimes crap can get stuck in there. Do make sure a lot of these times where you'll have these solenoid valves on the the control circuit. Typically for this, the power that actually powers this valve up will actually go through every single compressor contactor. And what that's there for is, so in this instance, on this example, we have two compressors, right? So what'll happen is it'll take the normally open set of contacts on the compressor contactors and basically run both of those through there and then back to common. So if God forbid both these compressors would not be running, or if any of the compressors are not running, it will not allow power to here, because then we don't want to dump more liquid into a header that when you don't have a compressor running. So sometimes what will happen is on the past PM, they won't even see it happen, or you'll see it intermittently happen where they'll backfeed because they won't wire in the auxiliaries properly. And then this will end up turning on and off, on and off, on and off. And because it's usually tied into here, this will also switch. You'll hear it switch, but then the compressor will shut off real quick and then it'll switch back and forth. I've seen that happen on multiple times, usually when a younger kid changes out the auxiliaries, because you have the auxiliaries that are flow through, right? Where what normally opens on this side, and then the other part of the normally open is on the other side. Or you'll have the one that has a little micro switch where the connections are all on the same side of the contactor. If it had the ones that were all on the same side of the contactor, and then all of a sudden they're doing the PM and they replace the contactors, now all of a sudden they think it's the same style, but it's not. And then they'll end up actually putting a hook the hot up to the actual split valve or the pump out valve.
That happens so much.
Yes, it does.
Especially when guys are going from square D contactors to like Mars or whatever brand that Mars has 40 things leased to. Whenever they go to those, it's always backwards, and it happens all the time. I found one on a rack one time where it was the same way wired in the same way you said, except that it was also controlling the split valve. So anytime the compressor shut off, it unsplit.
Well, that was the thing. We found the same thing, except for it was intermittently going into high pressure mode. Like it would randomly, the head pressure would just spike up. And then when we finally found what was wrong with it, because it was hooked up to a normally open solenoid. So normally, and so this one, like I said, this one's a three-way valve, but you can have a normally open solenoid here and a normally open solenoid here. And you're like, why the hell do you need two? You only have one that you're actually activating for split. That's because we need to make sure we still have even pressure drop. Same thing with the check valves here. Even though we're only splitting this side of the condenser where it says summer, we still need to make sure the pressure drop across it is the same pressure drop, right? So if we didn't have a check valve here, you'd actually have more flow going through this side of the condenser than what you would this one. So that's why they have two normally open solenoids on here, and then one just doesn't have a coil on it. And the same thing with the check valves.
So I got in an argument with somebody about this because we were doing this and they were saying it was unnecessary, that we only needed the check valve on one side. And you could physically, I've tested this on condensers where they're piped wrong. You could physically feel the side with no check valves. It has a different subcooling value than the side with check valves.
It would be lower. It would
Yeah,
be lower. It would be a lower subcooling value.
doing more work.
I had a buddy that I used to work with up in Pennsylvania. He moved down to somewhere down south, North Carolina or something like that. And he called me one day. He's like, "This one side doesn't have it." I'm like, "That's bad." And he's like, "How do I?" Because he was having head pressure issues and not enough liquid issues. So I was like, "Strap a probe on the outside of that one. Strap a probe on the outside of that one. And that's going to tell you if you had even subcooling or not."
So we're doing all these condenser change outs in every single store we go to.
Hmm.
It's piped wrong, pretty much. So we're going through and redoing them all the right way with a dummy valve and double checks. And I think that's part of the reason they had so many head pressure issues before is because the condensers were piped wrong from the get. That's why it's important to actually do this, and that's why manufacturers aren't just putting extra components in for no reason, especially with how cheap some of this stuff gets. They're not just giving away free parts for nothing. They're there for a reason. So that's why you're seeing the double check valves, and that's why it's important. Me personally, I'd much rather see a three-way valve. I think they're much more reliable in a split application, and it's
Hmm.
a lot easier. I like the three-way valve. On the three-way valves, guys, some of them you may see what they say is a B port. You'll see a Sportland with a B port. That when you see that B, it indicates a pump out. So it has its own internal pump out. Much slower than using a solenoid, but it's all internal into one. So you may only see one connection going from that three-way valve to the suction line. When it shifts, it's going to pump out through the three-way valve. But obviously, it's going to take a lot more time because you're pumping out through the discharge line, not the drop leg like you would be with the pump out solenoid.
Gotcha.
So you're going to have a lot more time on it. And the other thing is, you want to make sure you don't have a condenser that's splitting and on splitting constantly. You want to make sure you have enough dead band in there to where you're not splitting and on splitting constantly and causing liquid to go on the roof, then come back down, then go on the roof, and come back down. So you don't want to be doing that. You want to have it go into split and stay in split until it gets to a certain ambient dead band.
So
But
that's what I was gonna say. So that when that happens, when you have the solenoids piped in incorrectly, or I'm sorry, not solenoids, when you have that backfeed voltage or whatever, however many times that compressor is cycled, now that's how many times that valve is cycled. So as soon as we were done, like even before I called it, I'm like, hey, this thing was cycling 190 times a day or whatever it was. Guaranteed that valve's gonna be bad. And sure as shit, it did not see whatsoever because it just cycled itself to death.
yeah, it's you don't want that. Like you want that thing to cycle it max 1 to 2 times a day if it's splitting and on splitting. That's why I'm a big fan of having like a 5 to 10 degree dead band in the split, and then also getting that ambient temp sensor. All these customers are calling for it to be under the condenser. So what we've been doing lately is taking ambient sensors and putting them in PVC to try to keep them away from the condenser fans, especially if they're cycling the fans.
Mhm.
Because what'll happen is you'll get that heat coming down from the condenser if the fan's off, and then when it comes on, you get that instant cooling effect. And then if you don't have enough dead band in there in a time, it's going to split and unsplit constantly. You don't want that. Like that is bad on the condenser and bad on the operation.
The other thing I wanted to bring up real quick is just to show you the difference between the OE 25 and the OE or the E25. So this is a OE normally open valve. You can tell because it has a big old nut at the top. And instead of having just that little 5/16 screw like on the regular normally closed valve, it has an actual nut. Sometimes when you guys are, doing construction, make sure that they gave you the right stuff. I walked up on a rack that was having head pressure issues after a retrofit because they replaced all the gaskets and that and replaced all the rebuild kits. Unbeknownst to them that they had this stem, which will actually fit onto this. Um, and it was on the non-split side. It was on the so I walked up, and as soon as it went into split, it ended up going off on my head because it didn't have any flow going to either side of the condenser at that point. So just be mindful, and so this is also going to help you identify whether that valve, no matter where, is going to be either a normally open or a normally closed.
That's the big thing, making sure it's wired properly and all set up properly inside the controller. So if it is normally open, make sure if it's CPC or Copeland, make sure that your dip switch is correct, your wiring's correct. Danfoss, same way. Make sure your inversion is correct or your wiring is correct. And microthermal, just make sure that what your wiring is correct inside the controller of how it's going to be. So you want to make sure that's all good. If you're using, I am not a fan of this, but it is the only option sometimes is the automated ball valves. I am just not a fan of them. They have their place, especially on bigger stuff where you would have to have 5 or 6 like massive solenoids to split it, or because once you get over, I think it's 3/4 to a million BTUs, you can't use a three-way valve anymore. It's too big. You end up having to use automated ball valves.
Gotcha.
I'm not a huge fan just for the fact that they tend to fail if they're not set up properly and they cycle too much. But if they're set up properly, they do work. So it's just it's one of those things, making sure those ball valves are on and properly set up and function properly when you have split, testing them. So if you're going there to do winter PM, testing that ball valve to make sure it strokes properly and is holding and is tight. That's a big thing with those. And if you have double actuators, making sure both actuators are working. Because I've seen this time and time again where one actuator will start to close and it just doesn't have enough push to get it all the way closed. And it was ended up being one of the other actuators is toast. Amping them out as you're doing it to make sure that both actuators are actually physically powered on and drawing amps and closing. So that's going to be your bigger racks where they're splitting like that, or your stuff that's been retrofitted. We did some on the roof, making sure that they're in weatherproof boxes. They do make Mueller makes a weatherproof box for them, so the actuators won't get wet, and they function fine when they're set up properly. But they are not going to handle splitting in on splitting 100 times a day. Like
Um,
it'll be toast.
so the other thing is too, you're talking about ambient temperature sensors. So I just want to show everybody. So underneath you, it's going to be underneath the summer winter. So the one that actually sees both summer and winter. Because once if you shut down the summer side and there's no airflow, guess what? It's not really getting an accurate representation if that fan is still rolling. Also, you got to make sure it's the first fan on the header, which should be right where you're turning everything off. Because you're trying to make sure you're not causing that much of a temperature change. So you wouldn't do the one farthest away from the header because yeah, it could cause thermal twisting on the metal. Also, making sure that your pressure transducers, especially for your head pressure and especially for your drop leg pressure, are accurate or at least calibrated. And the reason for that is you can have a pressure transducer or temperature sensor telling you that the pressure is higher, but if that is the controlling factor, then it's going to try to run the pressures lower. So if you go and do your PM and actually set these valves the way they should, then you might end up holding more liquid into here because let's just say it was reading 20 pounds off than what it was on the drain leg. And then essentially thinks it has to pull it down lower based off the ambient. And then in tow, it ends up holding more liquid into the condenser and not letting out to the receiver.
Yeah. I mean, making sure that everything is functioning properly. I'm not a big fan of offsets. Anything more than 5 pounds on a transducer, it's getting replaced. Generally, I don't have to offset transducers very much. The transducers very much. I generally find when guys are offsetting transducers, they're usually either bad or their gauges are off. I mean,
I see.
that's my big thing is making sure that, and then making sure that the temp sensor is accurate because that drop like temp sensor is a troubleshooting tool that could help you if you're getting a massive amount of subcooling on there. You may be holding back too much and you may be flooding the condenser when you don't need to be. So that's a troubleshooting tool. So making sure that is accurate, and then making sure that your refrigerant pumps out. And then here's a big thing with me. I like to change the refrigerant low liquid level when where I'm in split. I want to go higher. So if it pumps out and it's at 55, 40%, like I want to raise the refrigerant alarm by 25%. Because if it leaks out, I would rather not lose the entire split charge and then there's an issue.
So what I would recommend in that instance, there's a real cool way you could do this. You can still have your low liquid level on your condenser control. I like having it as a separate sensor control. So what you could do is only activate the sensor control for the low liquid alarm based off of if you are in split or if you're not.
It's a
So,
right point.
huh?
It's a writable point.
It is.
Yeah, you can write to it
Oh, okay.
off an AO. So you could write a flexible combiner that
Okay. All right. Just
easy one though.
you could do it, but an easier, simpler way to do it, so like everyone understands. You take the split command and activate this liquid level for 25% when we're in split, and activate a low liquid level on the regular when we're not in when we're not split down to the 5 or 10 wherever the customer wants it.
Yeah, that's that
Instead of getting a flexible combiner involved, because it takes a minute to understand that. You know what I mean?
but yeah, you could do it that way too, or you could do two sensor controls and a bypass, like a winner sense. But I like to raise the low liquid level up. Why not? If you have all that refrigerant sitting in there, why waste it? Because if you have a leak and you're down to 30% in split, 20% in split, what's going to happen when it on splits come spring? You're low on gas.
Yeah,
And
100%.
now you're looking for a tiny leak. So that's a big thing. And then we'll jump off the condensers because we've talked about that enough. Crankcase heaters. That's my big thing. And it's looking for winter work. I always tell guys, dude, go through all the crankcase heaters. You're bound to find one or two that are bad. And out of those one or two that are bad, why not just order crankcase heaters and get them replaced?
What's a crankcase heater?
What?
I have a question. What, because I've never seen this happen. What if you have a cranky seater not working on a compressor, on a CO2 compressor specifically in the wintertime, and that rack is up on the roof? What? Oh, yeah, yeah, that's why I'm asking. What's going to happen?
It's going to condense depending on how worn the body is.
Yeah.
Depending on how warm the body. So I've seen it 50-50. I've
Hmm.
seen them where there's enough heat in the enclosure and the body stays warm.
Hmm.
And I've seen them where they condense liquid and they foam out and they cause issues and they pump all the oil out.
That's why I brought it up, and that's why I
See, like,
asked.
usually it's not as big of a deal because it'll pump the oil out. Okay, the liquid will pump the oil out. It'll
Mhm.
end up getting out, and then it's not like a flood out situation. It's a flooded start, definitely, but it's not like a flood out situation where it's just drinking liquid down the suction and washing all the oil out. But
Gotcha.
no, it's bad. So making sure your crankcase heaters work, especially with like racks and a roof. Rack, don't don't not today. The making sure the racks up there, those ones, the crankcase heaters work, and then your single units, making sure those are super important. Making sure that those ones actually work and draw amps and are all functional, because that's another big thing that causes compressors to fail. And then this is a big one that everybody seems to not pay attention to: the louvers and the exhaust fans. Make sure the exhaust fans still aren't forced on or jammed up or ran all the way down to -20 from some service guy walking in there, just grabbing the exhaust fan dial and running all the way down because it's hot. Make sure those are set and make sure the louvers close properly, because you don't want that. I hate you so much. Uh, make sure that make sure that the louvers for the exhaust fan close and the intake louvers close, because you don't want that cold air wafting in there and freezing a water line or causing the rack to condense liquid and something, because that's a possibility. You're muted. I hate you.
Sorry.
You're such an ass.
Oh, now you screwed me up. Now you confused me. What else can happen? What's that?
Why don't you go over receiver heaters?
Sure. Receiver heaters are there, I guess, to make sure that the pressure doesn't. Wait, you're talking about oil receiver or regular receiver?
Regular receiver.
Just to make sure the pressure doesn't get too low because it's being outside.
But yeah, it's there to make sure that if this thing shuts down, it's going to be able to start back up because your gas is going to log out there, especially if your receiver's outside. Making sure you get enough heat on that receiver to keep everything flowing and moving.
So
So
what do you usually set them for? 'Cause I've seen them for 50, which really doesn't make any sense. I'd rather have them to like, I guess it does, like say 55, 60, because you
I
want to make
I
sure it
set
doesn't
up
go.
the A9, whatever the A9 is under.
Okay. So the receiver pressurization valve. Okay. All right. So let me bring up the right thing this time. I just want to make sure I don't
So
screw.
I always set my valves at 60 and 55. So 60 for the holdback, 55 for the receiver pressurization. So I'll set
Mhm,
that receiver heater right around there. Let me tell you, I absolutely screwed myself on a startup one time
mhm,
because I didn't check the receiver heater, and we had just got the racks running. It was like a Thursday. Got the racks running. Well, it went into pump down. Something happened. The main liquid line solenoid shut. Went into pump down. The
mhm.
receiver heater was forced on. It blew the whole charge.
Oh, damn. Hold on. Oh crap! Wrong one again. So yeah, so the receiver heater would be somewhere like on here. Usually on when these are outside, you'll see the actual receiver be wrapped with Armaflex, and then you'll have an ambient thermostat. And so what he's talking about when he's talking about the A9, he's talking about this pretty valve right here, or what I lovingly refer to as the receiver repressurization valve. So the theory is, so if we're at a certain customer that looks like a bullseye, this valve right here, if we're dealing with 448 or 449, would be set for 148 pounds, right? Which is, I think, is 70 degrees saturated, right? And so if this is trying to maintain a certain pressure within, this is what we refer to as an inlet pressure regulator. So it has this, the pressure, you have the wind blowing across the condenser fans. They're not spinning, but you still have wind and cold air going across it. So the pressure is going to continue to drop. So as that continues to drop, this valve will start closing down in order to flood this condenser fully full of liquid. And then because this is closing here, this outlet pressure here will start to continue to drop because now we're just basically just trying to maintain this pressure in the summer winter side. So as this holding on at 148, this one right here, as that pressure drops, it might go down to 140, 145, 135, and all the way down to whatever you're going to set this one at. So in the bullseye stores, you have, like I said, you have this at 148 and you have this at 128 for 448 and 449. So as this valve closes down, this pressure going out to the receiver is going to drop. And so this is basically taking a little bit of discharge gas and then repressurizing this out here to help push the flow of that liquid down the line. And then he like what Kev recommends is setting this receiver heater for basically whatever you're setting this bad boy at for saturated, you know, because
Yeah,
most of the time the bulbs are just ambient bulbs.
yeah. Oh, ambient, or they're underneath the receiver jacket.
Um,
It should be on the receiver itself. It should be underneath the insulation. So
Speaking of heaters, sometimes you also will see a heater around the oil separator. Some bigger like light industrial is what I call it, just basically a just big horsepower rack. Your load might slow down, especially on a bigger facility if they have docks, where the docks usually having to run down to 45 or 40 degrees. Now it's cold as shit outside. So a lot of times they'll have the doors open, and so the dock won't barely have any load. So sometimes what will happen is if you don't have any load on the compressors, then you're not really generating that much heat. If you're not generating that much heat, the oil separator won't heat up that much or enough where it'll actually start getting close to what the physical temperature will be close to the saturated. And if that happens, you'll produce liquid in here, which means you'll just put liquid directly into the oil reservoir, which means you'll put our liquid directly into the compressors.
I'm a
So
big fan of putting those band heaters on the oil reservoirs when they're on their roof. I
yeah,
don't don't even.
I wasn't going to.
I'm a big fan of those. And then another issue, I hate you. You see it in every time you move your mouse, it just comes back up.
Comedy comes in threes.
So a lot of rooftop racks, especially like rack boxes, like those smaller ones in a Walmart's, where They have 3 compressors, not a lot of load,
Mhm.
and they have a low pressure oil system. I've seen this time and time again where you don't have a lot of oil flow. You got one compressor running and it's really cold out, and you lose pressure on the oil reservoir because it's so cold. So what we've had to do in the past is run a line to the discharge line to the top of the oil reservoir,
Mhm.
and we've had to crack it open. So there's constantly hot discharge gas going into the oil reservoir and venting off into the suction to keep the oil warm and keep it from condensing, and then also keep pressure in there so we could actually flow the oil that's coming into the reservoir out to the compressors. That has been a known issue with that, and I've messed around with it, and I know there's one rack out there at an independent where I have a solenoid doing it and a transducer, and when it gets to a certain temperature or a certain pressure, it ends up injecting hot gas in there to keep the pressure up.
Hmm.
But that is a good bush fix in the middle of the night when it's cold.
You haven't said that for a while. Bush fix. I didn't know what that was up until a couple months ago. Another thing that might happen, and I've seen this a couple times on some racks, usually Tyler racks, and they are, yes, they are still out there. I've seen where they have essentially a turbo shed down here at the bottom for the oil separator, and then it feeds to an oil reservoir just for extra oil capacity. I don't know the real reason. I don't understand that. I never understood that. Someone told me it was because of it needs more oil capacity, so they slapped that on there, which doesn't really make much sense because these are discharge CFM based as far as the helical ones, right? And if the compressors all have oil in it and has an oil separator and you're putting enough fluid in there, you shouldn't need an extra reservoir. But typically we're dropping the pressure with this with the OCV. So you might drop it down to 20 or 30 pounds above suction, above the lowest suction. We're no close to what the temperature is. But when you don't have an OCV here, now this is going to be essentially at discharge pressure. It's going to be whatever the oil pressure is. And so let's just say, I don't know, 70 degrees saturated or 60 degrees saturated. And then it might be 40 or 30, or in Kevin's instance, it might be negative 10-degree ambient. So what happens is this starts getting stupid cold. And then the vapor that's in here will then condense into a liquid. The liquid's going to drop to the bottom, oil drop will raise to the top, and then feeding your compressors once again straight up liquid. I've seen a high pressure valve. So in this instance right here, this is a low pressure system. So if this was a high pressure system, basically you would have some kind of oil regulating valve, whether it be a 1036 or an 826. And I've seen that one, that the 826 one that's on the Husman rack, look like a damn expansion valve. Like it was
Oh
frosting that much. Yeah.
yeah, those ones get bad. You're just like you look over and you're like, it's gonna be a bad time.
No, it's weird because if you look through the history, you'll see like intermittent oil failures, and it was like, oh, you came back to store, reset the oil failure, no problems. Because if it warms up, that liquid that was in there might have dissipated at that point. Because then as it warmed up, then you got more load on the rack, and wham bam, thank you, ma'am. Now that liquid will be gone.
I'm
Um,
pretty sure those oil reservoirs were all like some engineer being like, "This is new. I don't trust this. Let's throw this 13-gallon tank on the floor and see what it does." Those
yeah,
Tyler racks were the best racks ever made.
I like them. I'm a fan. Definitely a fan.
There's still a ton of them out by us because they were made like 45 minutes from my house. There's tons of them out here. Those racks in the wintertime run like a champ. We're not going to go over the EnviroGuard. That's a whole nother deal. But so making sure, guys, that like you're going through all these winter settings and making sure that you got enough liquid in there. These things will chug. And then the other thing is making sure your cycle counts are low in your compressors. If your suctions are ran down low and you're cycling EPRs, it's gonna affect your winter operation too. So make sure that rack is not cycling like crap. Make sure the unloading compressors are, working and unloading and you have enough load. So if that suction's ran down too low, you're not going to stay running. It's going to cycle off. And let's be honest, most of these racks, if it's minus 20 out, it's not starting back up on its own. Once it shuts off, it's done. You're going to get real lucky if it starts back up on its own.
Yeah.
So another
No,
thing, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say about just to tag on what you were saying, making sure that pressure transducer that's on the suction is accurate. Because, like you said, if it could be that someone just ran the suction down, like now with all the customers basically locking everyone out of the controllers, the probability of that happening is a little bit less, but it's still probable, right? Well, one thing is more probable is someone putting an offset in transducer, trying to do that, right? They're just saying that the suction pressure is higher, so essentially the compressor will try to run lower. When that happens, the cases are going to run down the temperature easier. So then they're going to close down the electronic EPRs. Once they close down the electronic EPRs, suction pressure is going to continue to drop. And like you said, it might overshoot. It might just it's going to cause not enough heat to get to the oil separator itself, and then potentially cause that issue that we talked about before. That because that could be another symptom of why you're getting liquid being created in that thing. So someone called me the one day. They were like, Brett, I don't know what's going on. He had that thing where he was getting oil that was it was supposed to be oil, but it was liquid feeding to this. He was in the middle of remodel, so that he had that going against him. And so essentially what happened was he didn't have enough load to keep the oil separator hot enough for it to actually stay hot enough. So in his instance, it was just because they were in the middle of remodel, taking load off, and then the temperature dropped super down. So what I read recommended to him, instead of raising the head pressure up like he tried, I told him to lower the head pressure, because at that point, then your expansion valves are going to want to stay open farther, because now your delta P is lower. And then that was able to load up more compressors enough that it was generating more heat here. So, like I said, not just the drop leg, not just the discharge, not just the ambient, but also check your suction transducer as well, because that will definitely affect how if the rack's going to shut down. Because a lot of times, if you've ever been there at 3 o'clock in the morning when that rack has been off for 2 hours because it's stalled out for some ungodly reason,
Pick the
it's not really
smallest
a fun time.
Pick the smallest, easiest to change compressor that's not under warranty and start it back up.
You know, this is a reclaimer.
No, my small reclaimer's been broke for 3 months now. So I only have the gigantic Navac one, and it's pretty heavy. So the chance of me getting that out for that, it's yeah. I snapped the crank on my small recovery machine.
Don't you have a battery powered one? No,
No,
not a
one of those Appian ones, and I'll admit those G5s will just take it. This time it got learned twice. It
it didn't take it.
it didn't. It was pumping out a receiver, and it was taking it. And then it stopped taking it.
It
Oh my
took
god!
it until it didn't.
I go trip the breaker, so I go reset it. I'm like, oh, it's going again. All of a sudden, I hear it's like jumping up and down 10 inches. I'm like, oh, that's not good. And I go over to go shut off. I hear snap, and then I just hear it freewheeling. Snap the crank in half.
That's amazing. At least it would have been better if it was just the coupling, but I get it.
Oh no, that's a solid crank in that thing. Like
Oh,
it's
really?
oh
There's no
yeah,
coupling in that one in the
yeah.
G5?
It just snapped the crank.
Hmm.
So yeah. So yeah, I generally don't use a recovery machine. If I'm gonna do it, I will usually pick the smallest compressor on the rack. I will front seat the suction valve, and I will let it you eat. Usually it'll boil off real quick because you're pulling it to a vacuum.
No, all I was gonna say is I think this is a good part to stop, man. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we didn't cover. We were beating the horse a little bit with the oil issues that you could have, but it's good stuff to know. But I think let's wrap this one up, and we'll record part 2 for this, and then finish all the rest of the stuff that we can go through as far as the PM.
All right, sounds good, guys. Have a nice night.
All right, till next time. See you guys.